How's everybody doing? Happy New Year. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Tuesday evening? Sharon in New Jersey, Shandora in the Bronx, David in Indiana, Stephen in New Hampshire, Paula in the Great Northwest. Bella in Florida, Bill in mid-Missouri. Hope everyone's first day back at work for the new year, assuming this was that date, which it is for most, was as mild as could be managed. Amen. Joe in the Inland Empire. Chaim in Florida, Marjorie in Virginia, Ella's in the house, Lynn in Silver Spring. Welcome, everybody. Nina is still away on the mom and daughter trip with our daughter. So I'm on my own. We'll do my best to scan comments at the end in order to answer questions. Our daf is relatively short this evening. It is page 61, which we're going to pick up a few paragraphs from the top with Mishna number 5 here in chapter 6 of Tractate Bava, Kamma, the 21st volume of the Talmud. Continuing our discussion of damages, how much is the one who causes the damages liable to pay in the case where the damage is caused by fire. Mishnah number 5. If one kindled a fire that crossed a fence that is 4 cubits high, or if the fire crossed the public thoroughfare, or if the fire crossed a river, and in each case it caused damage on the other side, he is exempt from liability. That's the Mishnah. Makes sense. You're creating a fire on your property, which you have a valid reason to do. I don't know if people still do this, but there used to be a time when people would burn leaves, I guess as a way to get rid of them, maybe turn them into fertilizer. I don't know. Maybe you're having a barbecue. Maybe you got a smokehouse. You're smoking some meat. Whatever the reason, you created a fire on your property. So the bottom line is, were you negligent in creating this fire in such a way that you caused it, or negligently caused it, to escape from your property and burn something else beyond your property, which caused damage, right? So one of the measures of were you negligent is, was there a barrier between your property, the fire on your property, and where it got to and caused damage. So one type of barrier is a fence, and we're learning it needs to be at least 4 cubits high, so about 6 feet. Another barrier is that there's a public domain, right? So in other words, there's a street abutting your property. Was the fire able to cross the street and get to the other side? Or what was the other one? Or a river, right? So were you making your fire on the edge of a river, and did it somehow get to the other side? Okay, so the Gemara asks, but isn't it taught in a baraisa, right? So remember that a baraisa, contemporaneous with a Mishnah, but the baraisas are teachings from that period that weren't considered quite authoritative enough to be included in the collection of Mishnahs that were redacted by Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. But we learn a lot about Mishnahs from baraisas, since we're not saying they're not authoritative, we're just saying they were not quite authoritative enough for Rebbe to include them. But we often learn by comparing how Mishnahs were formulated to baraisas that are similar. So, the Gemara asks, but isn't it taught in a baraisa that if a fire crossed a fence that is 4 cubits in height, the one who kindled the fire is liable. Didn't we just say in the Mishnah, if it crossed a fence 4 cubits high, he is exempt? So this appears to contradict the Mishnah. Rav Papa said there is no dispute between the Tana of the Mishnah and the Tana of the Baraisa. A Tana is a sage, one of the rabbis of that period of the Mishnahs and the Baraisas. So the Tana of our Mishnah counts downward from above to below. In other words, if the fire crossed a fence that was 6 cubits high, the one who kindled the fire is exempt from liability. If it crossed a fence that was 5 cubits high, he is exempt. And this is the law until the fire crosses a fence of a minimum of 4 cubits high, where the one who kindled the fire is still exempt. Conversely, the Tana of the Baraisa counts up from below to above. The meaning is that if the fire crossed a fence that was 2 cubits high, the one who kindled the fire is liable. And if the fire crossed a fence 3 cubits high, he is liable. And this is the law until the fire crosses a fence of a maximum of 4 cubits high, where the one who kindled the fire is still liable. There is no contradiction between the Mishnah and the Baraisa. Rava says, when they said in the Mishnah, with regard to a fire crossing a fence that was 4 cubits high, that the one who kindled the fire is exempt, well, this is even in a field of thorns. And Rav Papa says, and Rav's statement is referring to a case where the height of the fence is 4 cubits, counting from above the upper limit of the thorns. Right? So you've got to have a barrier 4 cubits high, protecting what is going to catch fire on the other side. So, for example, if there was a field of thorns and it was densely packed with dried shrubs, right, thorn bushes that are dry, and the level of the thorny bushes was 4 cubits high, so then it's not so hard to imagine that you're making a fire on your property, you've got this fence 4 cubits high. If any sparks get over the fence, boom, right there is the top level of the thorns. So they're saying, we're going to have a measure of a fence, but we have to understand in what situation that fence is sitting. So in the case of a field of thorns, what we want is 4 cubits of fence above the top level of where the thorns go to. Rav says they taught in the Mishnah that one is exempt from liability if the fire crosses a public thoroughfare, only in a case where the flame blazes high, bekolachat. But in a case where the flame blazes low, benich pefet, and therefore spreads easily along the ground, the one who kindled the fire is liable, even if the space that the fire crossed was up to 100 cubits. Right? In other words, what kind of fire were you creating? Right? If you're like on your property, you've got one of those, metal oil drums, and you put some firewood in there, and then you make a fire, right? And maybe you're cooking on top of it, or roasting marshmallows, or warming your hands. That's a very contained fire, and the heat, will just rise straight up out of that. If you're burning leaves in a field, right? Or I guess sometimes farmers will like burn old produce on a field just to kind of get a fresh start. So that's like a low fire over a wide area. That's much more likely to produce sparks and embers if any wind comes by that could get away across the whole length of the field. It's a much, much bigger hazard. And that's a distinction that's being made here. And so, having a public thoroughfare next to your property where you're making the fire is going to have a different outcome if it's just, this one fire that's going right, it's heat and embers are rising straight up, versus, this widespread burning the leaves or whatever produce of your field. And Shmuel said the Mishnah exempts one from liability if the fire crosses a public thoroughfare in a case where the flame blazes low, but in a case where the flame blazes high, even any minimal gap between where the fire was kindled and where it caused damage renders the one who kindled the fire exempt, right? In other words, because he's already taken precautions in the building of the fire, that it's not the kind of fire that is likely going to spread. And it is taught in a Baraisa in accordance with the opinion of Rav. In what case is this statement said that one is exempt if the fire crosses a public thoroughfare? It is in a case where the flame blazes high, a column. But in a case where the flame blazes low and there is wood to keep it burning, one is liable even if it causes damage at a distance of up to 100 mil, right? That's like 100 miles. So if the fire crossed a river or a pool, shalulit, of water that is 8 cubits wide, he is exempt from paying for the damage caused, regardless of whether the fire blazed high or low, right? Because presumably doing it alongside of a lake, okay, how much danger is it that it's really going to get across the lake? But, you know, if you've intentionally created a brush fire on your property and it extends and gets off your property, what do you expect? The Mishnah teaches, if the fire crossed the public thoroughfare, he is exempt. And the Gemara asks, who is the Tana who holds this opinion? And Rava said it is Rabbi Eliezer. As we learned in a Mishnah on page 61b, that Rabbi Eliezer says one is liable up to a distance of 16 cubits, like the width of the public domain. And by inference, one is exempt if a fire crosses a greater distance, i.e. across a public thoroughfare. So the Mishnah teaches, or if the fire crossed a river, he is exempt. And Rav says the term stream here means an actual river, and Shmuel says the term means a water channel. And the Gemara explains their dispute. The one who says that it is referring to an actual river, Rav, deems exempt one whose fire crosses a riverbed even when there is no water in it, since it is sufficiently deep and wide to prevent a typical fire from crossing it. But the one who says that it is referring to a water channel, Shmuel, holds that if the fire crosses a water channel that has water in it, yes, the one who kindled the fire is exempt. But if the fire crosses a water channel that does not have water in it, no, he is not exempt. We learned in a Mishnah elsewhere, tractate Peah, right, which is a tractate of Mishnayos, not Gemara, right? It's in the Mishnah, but not in the Talmud, or not, you know, it doesn't have Gemara, so it's not part of our collection of tractates. So we learned in a Mishnah elsewhere, in tractate Peah 2:1, and the following list of features divide a field for the purpose of Peah, right? Peah is the same word as payas, right? So on a Hasidic Jew, when you see the side locks, those are called payas. Why? Because they're growing out of the corner of his scalp. And that refers to the same word as Peah, which is a commandment in the Torah that a farmer does not harvest the corners of his field. He leaves whatever it is that he's growing in the corners standing there, and the poor, the widow, the orphan, the poor are invited to come and harvest that for themselves as a form of charity. So when you're talking about Peah, so these are this following list of features divide a field for the purpose of Peah, meaning it is no longer considered a single field, but instead Peah must be given from each separate section: a stream, a shalulit, a private road, and a public thoroughfare. Right? So if a stream cuts across your farm field, you might think, well, it's my field, right? I own both sides of it on both sides of the stream. So since it's my field, let's say it's overall a rectangle, so I have to leave 4 corners. So what we're learning here from Tractate Peah in the Mishnah is that if a stream runs right through, enters and leaves your field, well, it actually cuts your field into 2 pieces. And to properly leave Peah behind for the poor, you're going to have to leave 8 corners standing because the stream turned your field into 2 fields with 4 corners each. So the Gemara asks, and what is a shalulit? And that's what's relevant here. So Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says it is a place where rainwater gathers, a shalelin. And Rav Bava says that Rabbi Yochanan says it is a water channel that distributes its spoils, shalal, to its banks, since the water spreads to the adjacent cisterns. And the Gemara points out that according to the one who says that it means a place where rainwater gathers, Shmuel is the one who says that, since gathered rainwater divides a field, all the more so does a water channel, which is both larger and permanent, divide a field. But according to the one who says that only a water channel divides a field, Rabbi Yochanan, he holds that only what? That only divides a field, but a place where that only divides a field, but a place where rainwater gathers does not divide the field, since these are simply called pools of water in the land and are not considered significant enough to divide the field. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 5. Why do we get into those bodies of water? Presumably because of the discussion of if embers of your fire cross a body of water, are you exempt or not for causing damage? And that would depend on the kind of body of water that it is. Now we're on page 61b, and here comes Mishnah number 6 here in chapter 6. In a case of one who kindles a fire on his own premises, up to what distance may the fire travel within his property for him to still bear liability for damage caused? And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says the court views his location where he kindled the fire as if it were in the center of a base core, which is a pretty large volume of land, right? Where it's where you can plant 30 sa of seed. So think of it as a few acres. Therefore, if the fire spreads and causes damage farther away than a base core, the one who kindled the fire is exempt, since he could not anticipate that the fire would spread so far. And Rabbi Eliezer says one is liable up to a distance of 16 cubits, like the width of the public thoroughfare. Rabbi Kiva says one is liable for a distance of 50 cubits. Rabbi Shimon says the verse states in Exodus 22:5, the one who kindled the fire shall pay compensation, meaning that everything is according to the fire. Did the fire get away from you? You're going to be liable, right? So the idea is, even if you didn't have, right, that fence, a 4-cubit fence separating your property from the neighbor's property, but you built your fire, you have a big ranch, right, and you built your fire a mile away from the property line, you would think, I took precautions to make sure there wasn't any damage to my neighbor. I didn't think the fire would travel a mile within my property. Well, according to Rabbi Shimon, it sounds like you would be liable. According to Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Eliezer, you would not. That's the Mishnah. Here's the Gemara. So Rabbi Shimon appears to hold that there is no maximum distance which would exempt one from liability for the spreading of a fire that originated on his own property. And the Gemara asks, but isn't Rabbi Shimon of the opinion that there is a maximum limit concerning liability for fire beyond which one is exempt? Why would we think that about Rabbi Shimon? But didn't we learn in a Mishnah in Tractate Bava Basra, page 20b, a person may not stand an oven inside the house unless there is a height of 4 cubits to the ceiling above it, and out of concern that the ceiling might catch fire, right? So what is an oven in Talmudic times? We're talking about a clay structure, right, made out of pottery type of material that has a chamber inside, right, where you're going to put the food, and next to it there's the fire, and above it is a hole for the heat to escape. That does not sound like the type of object you'd want to erect and, burn and light up indoors. Okay, but if you live in a really cold place and you've got some kind of escape that you have, built into your house, so maybe you could. But if you're going to bring that kind of a hazardous, I think they're often called chimeneas. I mean, chimenea is like the word in Spanish for a chimney. But in LA, at least, when you use the word chimenea, you're talking about this kind of clay structure that people usually have them in their yards just to kind of make a fire that, you could roast marshmallows or really just to warm the people who are sitting around it. But it's almost like an egg shape, kind of an elongated egg. with the area for burning with an opening in the side and a hole in the top. So similar to that kind of oven. Right, so didn't we learn in this Mishna in Bava Basra that a person may not stand, right, this kind of clay oven inside the house unless there is a height of 4 cubits between the top of the oven and the ceiling, right, 6 feet above the oven, out of concern that the ceiling might catch fire. And similarly, if one lived on the second floor, or let's say in the attic, he should not do so unless there is plaster underneath it above the ceiling of the floor below of at least 3 handbreadths of thickness, out of concern that the floor might catch fire. And in the case of a stove, which is smaller and does not reach temperatures as high as those of an oven, a thickness of 1 handbreadth is sufficient. And even though he may place his oven or stove in this manner, if the fire from the oven or stove causes damage, he must pay for what it damaged. And that Mishnah continues. Rabbi Shimon says these measurements were stated only to teach that if the fire from the oven or stove causes damage, after the owner takes these precautions, he is exempt from paying compensation. So evidently, Rabbi Shimon does have a maximum distance beyond which one is not liable for his fire spreading and causing damage. So Rav Nachman says that Rabba Bar Avu says this is how Rabbi Shimon's statement in the Mishnah should be understood. Everything is according to the height of the fire. Everything is according to the height of the fire that he initially kindled. If it was a small fire, he is not liable to pay for damage caused by it if it traveled far. Whereas if he started a large fire, he is liable even if it traveled a great distance, because it's a much more hazardous type of fire. And Rav Yosef says that Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. And so Rav Nachman says that Shmuel says the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. All right, we're going to apply some kind of a reasonableness standard and say, okay, these heights of the fence or height of the ceiling above the oven, that's going to provide some guidance to a judge, who might be judging the case between a plaintiff and a defendant, where somebody's fire caused damage, let's say, to his neighbor, whether it's his upstairs or downstairs neighbor, or whether it's his neighbor next to his field. But everything is according to the type of fire that was created. How hazardous, how likely were embers and ashes and heat to escape from that kind of a fire? That's going to affect the outcome, not merely what is the distance between that fire and the neighbor, because, there's obviously a big difference between a little fire and a big fire. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 6. Here's Mishnah number 7. With regard to one who kindles a stack of wheat or barley, and there were vessels concealed inside the stack, and they caught fire and burned together with the stack, Rabbi Yehuda says the one who kindled the fire also pays compensation for what was inside the stack. But Rabbi Yehuda was in the minority, and we've learned this already before. The rabbis say he pays compensation only for the stack of wheat or barley, as the case may be, and he is not responsible for that which was concealed within it. If there was a goat tied to the stack of grain, and there was a Canaanite slave nearby who was not tied to it, and both the goat and the slave were burned together with the stack and they were killed, then the one who kindled the fire is liable to pay compensation for both. Conversely, if the slave was tied to the stack and there was a goat nearby that was not tied to it and they were both burned together with it, the one who kindled the fire is exempt from payment for damage because he is liable to receive capital punishment for murder, and he is punished only for the greater transgression. And the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Yehuda and exempt one from payment for vessels concealed inside the stack in the field concede to Rabbi Yehuda that if one sets fire to a building, he pays compensation for everything that was burned inside it, since it is the normal way of people to place items in houses. And the more sort of typical way to understand these vessels concealed in a stack of grain, what would that be? Well, what people would sometimes do is, let's say at harvest time, right? So he's got let's say it's a guy with a lot of fields, and he's got workers coming, and they're harvesting grain all day, and he doesn't have a combine and a tractor. They're doing it all by hand. So at the end of the first day, maybe they have 20 stacks of grain that have been bundled up, and they still got another 2/3 of the field to do. So they're going to return the next day and the day after. So at night, where do they store the tools? Maybe there's no shed with a lock on it to store the tools in it. So sometimes they would conceal the tools used for harvesting the grain within the stacks of grain. So that's a very common example of where there would be vessels, utensils, concealed within the stacks of grain. Now, if somebody starts a fire, first of all, he was very negligent if he started a fire that could spread to these stacks of grain, because the stacks of grain themselves are valuable. But he didn't know, and had no reason to know, that there were these tools and these utensils and vessels concealed within the stacks of grain. So his liability, if he's liable for starting a fire that burned the stacks, is just for the stacks and not what was concealed within it. According to the majority opinion, Rabbi Yehuda would deem him liable even for the tools that were within the stacks. Here's the Gemara on Mishnah number 7. Rav Kahana says, this dispute between the rabbis and Rabbi Yehuda concerning vessels concealed in a stack is referring specifically to a case where one kindled a fire on his own premises and the fire spread and consumed the stack on somebody else's property. In that case, Rabbi Yehuda deems the one who kindled the fire liable for damage to concealed articles that were damaged by the fire, but the rabbis, the majority, exempt him. But in a case of one who kindles a fire on another person's property, everyone agrees that he pays compensation for everything that is contained within it and which burns, right? So this exception of you're not liable for what was concealed, items that were concealed, is only because your fire spread from your property to your neighbor's property, which, was maybe you were negligent, but it wasn't really foreseeable. But if you start a fire on your neighbor's property, well, then any damage that it does, you're liable for that. Rava said to Rav Kahana, if so, that the rabbis concede to Rabbi Yehuda in the case of one who kindles the fire on the premises of another person, then, rather than teaching the latter clause that states the rabbis concede to Rabbi Yehuda that if one set fire to a building, he pays compensation for everything that was burned inside the building, since it is the normal way of people to place items in houses, let the Tana instead distinguish and teach the concession of the rabbis in the context of the same case of one setting a fire to a stack. Meaning, in what case was this statement said? It is said in a case where he kindled the fire on his own premises and it spread and consumed the stack on the premises of another. But if he kindled the fire on property belonging to another, all agree that he pays compensation for everything that was contained within it. And since the Mishnah is not worded in this manner, it seems that this is not the opinion of the rabbis. Rather, says Rava, the rabbis and Rabbi Yehuda disagree with regard to not one, concealed items or not concealed items, but rather with regard to two issues. They disagree with regard to the case of one who kindles a fire on his own premises and it then spreads and consumes a stack on the property of belonging to another, as Rabbi Yehuda deems him liable, even for a concealed article damaged by that fire, but the rabbis hold him not liable. And Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis also disagree in the case of one who kindles a fire on premises belonging to another person, as Rabbi Yehuda holds that he must pay compensation for everything within it, even a purse of money if it was concealed within the stack. But the rabbis hold that it is only for vessels that are typically concealed inside a stack, such as threshing tools or yokes for cattle, that he must pay compensation. But for vessels or other items that are not typically concealed inside a stack, he is not liable to pay compensation. And that is the law. And Rava derives that from the way that the Mishnah was worded, that it said that if you burn a building then you're liable for everything that's in that building, along with the building itself, because it is normal for people to store whatever they own inside of their house. And so when we extend that idea to the stack, we say, okay, you're liable for burning a stack if you start your fire on the property of another person, not only for the stack of grain, but for anything that was concealed in the stack of grain, assuming, or on the condition that what was concealed in that stack of grain is the kind of thing that people would normally conceal in a stack of grain, like the harvesting tools or the yoke of the cattle, but not a purse of money or something like that. The sages taught with regard to one who kindles a stack and there were vessels inside it that were burned. Rabbi Yehuda says the one who kindled the fire pays compensation for everything that was inside it. But the rabbis say he pays compensation only for the value of a stack of wheat or a stack of barley. And he does not pay compensation for the vessels. And the court views the place where the vessels were as if it were filled with grain, and calculates the amount and the compensation accordingly. Now we're on page 62a. With such a short daf today, we're going to just go a little bit forward. Get a start on tomorrow. So in what case is this statement said? It is in a case where one kindled a fire on his premises, and the fire spread and burned items in premises belonging to another. But with regard to one who kindles a fire on premises belonging to another that destroys a stack of wheat, all agree that he pays compensation for everything that was inside the stack. And Rabbi Yehuda concedes to the rabbis that in a case where one lends space to another in his field to stack grain, and this person stacked grain in the field and concealed items inside the stack, if the owner of the field causes the stack to be burned down, he pays compensation for the stack alone, since the other person did not have permission to conceal items inside his stack. Right? He had permission to put his stack there, but not to put his very valuable stack that had all kinds of hidden materials in it. And similarly, if one received permission to stack wheat in the field of another and he stacked barley, or conversely, if he received permission to stack barley and he stacked wheat, or similarly, if he stacked wheat and covered the stack with barley, or he stacked barley and covered the stack with wheat, in all these cases, Rabbi Yehuda concedes that he pays compensation for the barley alone, which is less than the value of the wheat. And Rava says, I'm almost done, so if you have questions or comments, please get them in now. Yeah. A second here. Okay. Questions or comments, please get them in, and then like I said, I'm on my own, so I'll have to scan. So Rava says, with regard to one who gives a gold dinar to a woman for safekeeping and says to her, be careful with this dinar because it is made out of silver. Right? He told her it's made out of silver when it's actually made out of gold. Now, and he says, be careful with it. If she herself damaged the dinar, she must pay compensation for the value of a gold dinar. And this is because he can say to her, what business did you have damaging it? If she was negligent and it was lost or stolen, she pays as compensation only the value of a silver dinar, since she can say to him, I undertook to safeguard only a silver dinar. I did not undertake to safeguard a gold dinar. Right? But if she herself damaged it, that's why she's liable for the cost of a gold dinar, because she undertook to safeguard it, so what was she doing damaging it? If it became damaged while it was in her possession, she's only going to be liable up to the amount of what she agreed to safeguard, which she thought it was a silver dinar, and that's why if it's lost or stolen while in her possession, she's only liable for a silver dinar, even if it was a gold dinar. And Rav Mordecai said to Rav Ashi, you teach this halacha, this law, as a statement of Rava. But for us, this halacha is obvious from the Baraisa that taught if one stacked wheat and covered the stack with barley, or stacked barley and covered the stack with wheat, the one responsible for the fire pays compensation for the barley alone. Evidently, the one who kindled the fire can say to the owner of the stack, I undertook to safeguard a stack of barley, but not a stack of wheat. And here too, in the case of a golden dinar presented as a silver dinar, the woman can say to him, I did not undertake to safeguard a gold dinar. That's where we're going to knock off for today. Okay. Jonathan, what if one keeps a kerosene lamp in the stack of wheat? Seems like we should not hold people to liability if the fire reaches an accelerant. This is a very interesting question, right? So now what we're talking about is not so much, does he owe the value of the accelerant, right? Does he owe him for the value not only of the wheat that was burned, but also the kerosene that was burned? But you're saying that somebody concealed this accelerant, this can of kerosene, in a stack of wheat. So my fire reached a stack of wheat, right? So that was negligent. But then let's say that once my fire reached the stack of wheat and it hit the kerosene, now it exploded. And now my fire, which would have only consumed that one stack of wheat, and I would have been liable for that, but now it explodes, and let's say it burns, several other stacks of wheat or even a house that it would not have reached but for the kerosene that was concealed in the stack of wheat. So it sounds like to me, now we're talking about the case of something that begins with negligence and then becomes an accident, right? Circumstances beyond my control. And remember, there were two views. One says, well, even if it ends as an accident, if it began with negligence, the one who's negligent is liable. So too bad, your negligence. You thought, well, even if I was negligent and something bad happens, the limit of my liability is a stack of wheat. Turns out you're liable for much more. According to the other view, that's something that begins as negligence, but then, accelerates into something larger. He's only liable, for what his negligence could have foreseeably caused. Then he wouldn't be liable for that explosion. Very interesting question. Joseph says, I found a base midrash I can use to read the Koren Talmud until I can get to the Judaica store to get my own. Not sure if I can buy individual tractates. You can definitely buy individual tractates of the Koren. In fact, I think you'll get them from Amazon. And you can certainly get them from Koren publishers. And you can get individual tractates for sure. And by the way, I think both Koren and Art Scroll are available in digital editions, which, won't help you on Shabbos when you shouldn't be reading a digital edition, but would be available the rest of the time. And that's a way to save money rather than getting, the full set of printed books. I'm pretty sure about that. Karen says, wouldn't it matter what the fence is made of? A stone fence might stop a fire, but a wooden fence, wouldn't it just be more fuel? Great point. And I think when they were talking about a fence, they were probably talking about a stone fence. As in like the Robert Frost poem that says, was it called Mending Wall, I think is the name of the poem, with the famous line, good fences make good neighbors, right? And they're definitely talking about a pile of stones between the fields. But I think you make a great point. If the fence itself is fuel, then one who builds a fire anywhere where it could reach that fence and catch fire, obviously he's going to have a lower bar to be found negligent than if it was a stone wall, sure. And Bill says, people absolutely still burn leaves and trash. In many rural areas, it's still legal, and some people don't care so much about the legality. So there you go. I live here in LA. I don't see burning leaves so often. But even where I grew up, which is a suburb about an hour north of New York City, which now is completely built out. There's just neighborhoods everywhere. But when I was growing up, there were still fields, there were still farms there, and I remember seeing people burning leaves. So there you go. And I think that's all the questions that I'm seeing. Okay, so that's it. So, all right, and Sharon is pointing out that Sefaria is free and has the Koran online. Exactly. If you go to sefaria.org and look up the Talmud, so what you're seeing there is the Stein Salz elucidation that is printed in the Koran, and it's available for free. But, maybe what you want is the books because you're a book lover like me, right, Yosef? And, and then you could take notes in it, etc. But until then, you got the Koran. You can have the Safari. So that's what I've got for today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Wednesday, at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.